Exodus chapter 15, though, at least the first part of it, deals with singing in a song that Moses and the Israelites sang unto the Lord after they crossed the Red Sea. And, of course, there's a multitude of things that we can always learn from studying these songs, but what I want to really focus on tonight is simply the idea of we learn some of the elements that should be present whenever we are praising the Lord, and specifically whenever we are praising the Lord in song. And so as you begin looking at Exodus chapter 15, remember that the enemies of Israel have been drowned. Their freedom is now secure. And so what do you do whenever your enemy is defeated and your freedom is secure? Well, they burst out in a song in praise unto the Lord. As you study the history of Israel, you don't read about them singing while they're slaves in Egypt. You don't even really read about them singing as they're journeying out from Egypt to the Red Sea. And they were, most of the time during that period, I think what you read about is they were complaining to Moses, and even after they left, they were asking Moses if they could go back or to take them back. But it's a great lesson for us, because I think what it indicates is it takes true Christian maturity for a person to, quote-unquote, have a song in the night. You know, I think about Paul as he's, the events that are recorded about him in Acts chapter 16, as he's in that Philippian jail and he's singing the praises of God about midnight. That'd be something that'd be difficult to do, wouldn't it? And so I think what we're reading about here is a people who, at this point, they're really very immature in their faith toward God. They're just starting to learn about God and understand some things about Him. And so they're not really established in what we would think of as being the Christian faith today. This hymn, some people say that it actually has 4 stanzas. I'm just going to divide it into 3 tonight for brevity and time's sake. And so we're going to look at 3 different ideas that are presented to us in this song, and then talk a little bit about or incorporate the idea about how those same elements should be present in our singing and our praising the Lord today. The first thing that we're going to look at tonight, though, is the idea of God's victory being announced. If you notice the beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord." Well, the Bible indicates to us that they sang this song to the Lord, but I also want to emphasize this wasn't just a song that was sung to the Lord. This was actually a song that was about the Lord. In fact, as you read through this hymn, you'll find at least 10 different occasions where the name of the Lord, the name Jehovah, is mentioned specifically in this song. And so what we learn is that worshiping God in song involves singing about who God is, and it involves singing about what God has done for His people. And the main theme, at least in the beginning of this song, or the first stanza, is that God has given His people victory. What we learn about as you look through these first 5 verses in this chapter is this song talks about, or sings about, we should say, how it was a glorious victory that God was able to win over His enemies. In fact, notice the second part there of verse 1. It says, "He hath triumphed gloriously, the horse and his rider hath He thrown into the sea." So the song describes to us not only the fact that God Himself won the victory in this battle, but the type of victory that God won. It was a very glorious thing that God was able to accomplish through this victory. Of course, we know that the way that God won this victory, as is mentioned there in verse 1, the horse and the rider were thrown into the sea. If you go down to verses 4 and 5 of this same chapter, this idea is again mentioned when it says, "Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them, they sank into the bottom as a stone." In verse 10, he says, "Thou didst blow with thy wind, the sea covered them, they sank as lead in the mighty waters." I don't know if you ever thought about the idea, but the way that God won this victory over Egypt and over Pharaoh and over his army was a very glorious thing, because there was a lot of irony that was involved in the way that God defeated the Egyptians. Remember back in the beginning as we began studying the children of Israel in Egyptian captivity and the persecution of Pharaoh against them, remember the sentence, the order, the command that Pharaoh executed or gave, and that was that the Israelites, at least the male Hebrew babies, were supposed to be drowned in the waters of the Nile River. Pharaoh was intending to destroy Israel by drowning them in the waters of his own land. But what happens is actually God ends up defeating Pharaoh by drowning him and his soldiers and his horses and destroying all of his glorious army that he had in the waters of Egypt themselves. And so you have a little bit of this idea, and I think that's really what's being entailed in that this was a glorious victory. Not only that God won, not only that he triumphed over his enemies, but he actually used the very manner, the very element that they hoped to destroy Israel with to destroy them. The second thing that you'll learn about this victory that God won is the idea that the Lord is a man of war. I don't think when we often think about God, we think of God as being a man of war. In fact, the idea of God being a God of war is something that some people in the religious world, and even those who would profess to be Christians today, they might find that a little bit unsettling and bothersome. To many people today, they feel like war is an idea that is opposed to the gospel of Christ, or war is a thing that would be against the manner of Christian living that's described to us in God's Word. I even read about the idea there have been some denominations that have gone so far as, because they're so offended by the idea of the Lord being a man of war, that they've actually removed what we would consider militant songs out of their songbooks. You might be asking the question, well, what type of songs are you talking about? One of them that I read about was the song Onward Christian Soldiers. So it's been removed from some of the denomination's songbook because they say that's just not an idea that the gospel portrays to us, the idea of war. It's not an idea that would fall within the consistent manner of Christian living. But Moses promised Israel back in Exodus chapter 14 and verse 14, he said, "The Lord shall fight for you." Do you think God is a God of war? Read the Old Testament. God fought for his people time and time again. And understand this, God's character is such, he is of such a being and a person and a character that he has to fight. He cannot but fight. In fact, God has to fight against evil, and he has to fight against wickedness, and he has to wage war against Satan. That's just who God is and what he is about. The very word itself, victory. When you think about victory, what do you think about? Well, I would think about a battle, wouldn't you? I would think about a fight. At the very least, we might say the word would imply a contest or a competition of some sorts. And so the idea of God being a Lord of war is not something that is foreign to the Scripture. The idea of God being a God who fights for his people and against his enemies is not something that would destroy the teachings of the Bible. In fact, we read about this very idea of God being victorious, of fighting for his people and conquering his enemies in this great song that was sung. I have a heading in my Bible, and I know that headings aren't necessarily inspired, but in chapter 16, the heading or chapter 15, I'll get the right one in a minute here. In chapter 15, the heading in my Bible is what's called the Song of Moses. And there's a statement that's made a little later on, well, a lot later on in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 15 and verse 3, here's what's said about those in the host of heaven. It says, "And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty, just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints." If this is the song that's being sung, and people within the religious world today are taking exception to this idea of the Lord being a man of war, if we're going to sing that same song in heaven, and that song is still being sung in heaven today, just exactly what Moses and Israel sang that day, you know what the song was about? It was about the Lord being a man of war, wasn't it? It was about the idea of God fighting for his people and of giving them a victory over his enemies. And so the first idea that's presented to us in this song is the victories that God has won. Well, think about how that applies to our singing today. There are many songs that we sing today that emphasize the victories that God has won over his enemies and for his people. We sing a song that's entitled Victory in Jesus. There are numerous songs like that in our songbooks that emphasize this particular quality and characteristic of God. And so when we praise the Lord, yes, part of praising the Lord and singing to him is singing about the glorious victories that he has won over his enemies and for his people. The second part of this song that I want us to think about tonight is where God's weapons are basically described to us in this song. And we all know as we read through the Bible and study his word that the weapons that God chooses aren't necessarily the same weapons that we would choose to wage a war today. In fact, if you look down in verse 6 in chapter 15, it says, "Thy right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. And in the greatness of thine excellency thou hast overthrown them that rose up against thee. Thou sentest forth thy wrath, which consumed them as stubble. And with the blast of thy nostrils the waters were gathered together. The floods stood upright as a heap, and the depths were congealed into the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My lust shall be satisfied upon them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. Thou didst blow with thy wind, the sea covered them. They sank as lead in the mighty waters." What you read about, or what we're reading about as we go through this song, is these are divine attributes of God that are described to us in human characteristics. And so it talks about how God used his right hand to destroy his enemies. Well, we all know that God is a spirit. He's not a human being. He doesn't live in a human body. Does he literally have a right hand like we do? No. But the idea of God, you know, what he uses and how he accomplished things is being described to us in terms that we can relate to and we can understand. And so you'll see several characteristics of that where the writer is using human traits to describe divine characteristics of God. His right hand smashes the enemy. His majesty, the glory, how glorious God is setting upon his throne. It's the idea, it was literally so great and glorious and bright that it knocked down those who were standing against him. Talks about how his wrath burned up his enemies like fire would burn up straw, and how his breath blew back the waters and stood them up like a wall. And I don't think necessarily what's being indicated to us is God chose the right weapons in this battle, you know, because the things that he chose were so mighty. Well, think about that idea. If we were going out to fight a battle today, would you just use your right hand? You might say, well, if you're in a fist fight, you would, right? But generally speaking, in a war, people are using greater weapons, physically speaking, than their right hands. Would you use majesty to try to destroy your enemy? Would you just rely upon your wrath to be good enough to win you that war? Would you use your breath to try to defeat your enemy? Well, those are all things that we look at in our world and as humans and say, those aren't powerful weapons. You know, those aren't things that would be the normal choice of a person who's physically minded and going out to fight a war against his enemies. And so what the song indicates to us is not necessarily the weapons that God chose were so mighty, but whatever weapon God chooses is mighty in his hand. And so the particular weapon that we read about, of course, that was mighty in the hand of God in this instance was water. Again, that's not an element that we would think involving in a war. That would be something that we would probably incorporate into our arsenal. You know, we go out with a water gun, we're not going to win very many wars with that. But you put water in the hand of God, and he can use that in a very mighty way to destroy his enemies. I was thinking about some of the stories that are relayed to us in the Bible where weapons that were chosen were not extraordinary by human or physical means. God can use pitchers and torches and trumpets to defeat entire nations. We read about a man who picked up 5 smooth stones and defeated an immeasurable giant, a man of great stature of that day and age. Those aren't normal weapons that people would choose. And so they weren't mighty weapons because of their physical power and strength. They were mighty weapons because they were held in the hand of God. And whatever God uses is going to be mighty in nature. And so what I learned from that is the songs that we sing should emphasize the might that our God has. It's those small and those insignificant weapons that he often uses to defeat our enemies and give us the victory, they're just indicative of the great power and might and majesty that relies or involves in the hands of our God. And so our singing should be sure to describe those things and magnify and praise the name of God, just like Israel's singing did too. The third thing that I want us to think about tonight in the last part of this song is God's character is extolled or exalted. And there's basically two things that are really emphasized at the end of this song. The first one is the idea of who is like Jehovah, who is like the Lord. In fact, that's the very question that's asked in verse 11 in this song. It begins by saying, who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like unto thee, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? Thou stretchest out thy right hand, the earth swallowed them. Thou in thy mercy hast led forth thy people, which thou hast redeemed. Thou hast guided them in thy strength unto thy holy habitation. Of course, what Israel sang about that day was in part the 10 plagues that God had accomplished, and how those 10 plagues really magnified different characteristics of God. We've already studied about those plagues, and we've talked about how through those plagues, God displayed not only to Israel, but also to the Egyptians, that there was no one like him. The gods and the goddesses that the Egyptians worshiped were nothing like the God that Israel served. And so the question begins when you start reading about God, and there's a couple things that are mentioned specifically here in these verses that we read. Who has the power to destroy like Jehovah? Who has the quality to be merciful and deliver people like Jehovah does? Who has the wisdom to guide humanity like Jehovah does? And the answer is there's no one like Jehovah God. There is nothing that we can conceive of. There is no human being. There is no false deity that men worship who lay claim to the power and the characteristics like Jehovah God does. And so our singing should be such that it magnifies these different characteristics of God, whether it be his power to destroy, whether it be his mercy to deliver us, any of those things that you would think about that are associated with the divine character of God. And when we sing about those things, it leads us to ask this question: who is like God? Who is like Jehovah? And the answer, of course, is no one is like him. And so the character of God is being exalted or extolled in this song. The second part of that is these qualities and these characteristics that we're reading about, they did one thing to the enemies of God, or at least one thing, and that is they put the fear of God in them, so to speak. They instilled fear within those enemies who were going to come face to face with God's people and with God himself. And so if you look at verse 14 there in Exodus 15, it said, the people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold of the inhabitants of Palestina. Then the dukes of Edom shall be amazed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling, shall take hold upon them. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. Fear and dread shall be upon them. By the greatness of thine arm they shall be as still as stone, till thy people pass over, O Lord, till thy people pass over, which thou hast purchased. We know that God brought Israel out of Egypt for a reason. God didn't just bring them out of Egypt to let them live in the wilderness forever. They were headed to a new land. And of course that new land was the land of the Canaanites, the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants long ago. And the news of the Exodus of Israel coming up out of Egypt traveled very quickly to those Canaanite people. In fact, the manner of the Exodus, the way that the children of Israel came up out of Egypt, the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the destruction of the entire Egyptian army, the two great kings that we read about, Sihon and Og, who lived between Egypt and the Canaanites, and their defeat. All of those things and the news of those things spread to the ears of the Canaanite people very quickly. And of course, when they heard those things, it put fear into their hearts, because they knew that they were next. They knew that the children of Israel were coming for them. They knew that God was fighting against them. And that made them very afraid. We read about an element of that fear in the book of Joshua. Remember when Joshua sends the spies to the city of Jericho and Rahab hides them? Her conversation with them has always been very interesting to me because it depicts to us the emotional mindset of the people in that land. And she says to them, it's recorded in Joshua 2, beginning in verse 9. She says, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came up out of Egypt, and what you did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our heart did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. What the Canaanites knew from hearing these stories is they knew that the God of Israel, that Jehovah, was more powerful than their gods. They knew that the Israelites were going to take their land. They knew that they were going to win these victories over them. And so that instilled fear within their minds. What did those things? Talking about the characteristics of God. And so one of the benefits of singing about the characteristics of God, of praising the Lord in song and praising Him for these great characteristics that He has, is that it should instill fear within the hearts of our enemies. Just like it leads us to ask the question, who is there, what being is there like the Lord? It's kind of interesting as you look at this song in chapter 15. It seems like it's what we would call a reciprocal song, and that was kind of the style that the Jews usually sang. Even in the synagogues and in the temple, they would kind of have, one side and another side where one would sing a certain part of the song, maybe asking a question, and the other side would sing back the reply. And what it seems like as you read this song is there were 2 divisions, and they were divided into males and females. And so you have Moses and the males in the first part of this chapter singing the praises to God. And then you have Miriam leading this group of Jewish women who assisted as they either repeated the first words or they repeated the same words that the men sung, or else they replied some of these things that we read about there. But you can't help but notice the joyful enthusiasm that these people would have as they sang these great words. However, as is the case with Israel, that joyful enthusiasm didn't last very long. In fact, we read in the book of Psalms, in Psalm 106, beginning in verse 11, it says, the waters covered their enemies, there was not one of them left. Then believed they his words, they sang his praises. And if the story ended right there, we might say, man, that's some of the most encouraging things that you could read about God's people here. But the psalmist picks up again in verse 13 and says this. He says, they soon forgot his works. They waited not for his counsel. I thought about that and thought about the idea, how many times are we like the children of Israel? How many times do we sing these great things about God that magnify Him and make us ask the question, who is like Him? And think about the great might that He possesses by these puny weapons that He uses to accomplish great victories. And then we sing these great things about God and these victories that He's won for us and how He has defeated our enemies. And then we turn around, we walk into the world, and we forget about the words we just sang. How many times are we like those children of Israel? Well, this song isn't the end, of course, of the story of the children of Israel. The nation singing is soon going to be turned into complaining in the wilderness as they're heading toward Mount Sinai. And I think what they learned is it wasn't easy to carry this new burden of freedom that they found. And what God is going to teach them is He's going to teach them how to live with this freedom one day at a time. Maybe there's one here tonight, though, who has never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ.